So today I want to talk about something that happened this morning, not yesterday, not last week, this morning. Because at 10 a.m. Eastern time today, the United States Navy began coercing a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. And now I want to review exactly what that means. Not the way CNN will explain it, not the way Fox News will explain it. I want to explain what is actually happening underneath the surface. Because the headline is dramatic, but the real story is much more dangerous than the headline. Let me start with one fact, one single fact that I think changes everything about how you understand this blockade. At the moment the U.S. Navy began this blockade, Chinese ships were already inside the Strait of Hormuz. Let me say that again. When America announced it would stop all ships from entering or leaving Hormuz, China's ships were already in there, already past the gate, already inside. And those ships are carrying Chinese oil, Chinese cargo, Chinese goods, moving between Iran and China under a deal that Iran made specifically with Beijing. Now, before I tell you what this means, I want to explain something about the Strait of Hormuz that most people do not fully understand. The strait is not like a road where you can put up a sign and block the traffic. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. That is roughly the distance from New York City to New Jersey. And on any normal day, something like 20% of the entire world's oil passes through that gap every single day. 20% of the world's oil moving through a gap that is 33 kilometers wide. When Iran closed it in February, when the war started, they did not need to physically block every single ship. What they did is they made it dangerous. They put mines in the water. They launched warning missiles. They made shipping companies say, this is too risky, and turn their ships around. And that worked. Oil prices shot up 44% since the war began. Now America is doing this same thing in reverse. America is not physically blocking every ship. America is creating the credible threat that if you try to move through that strait, there will be consequences. That is what a blockade is, not a wall, a threat. But here is where this gets very complicated. And this is the part I do not think anyone is explaining clearly. Iran did not close Hormuz to everyone. That is an important distinction. Iran closed Hormuz to America, to Israel, and to Western allies. But Iran kept it open for specific countries. China, Russia, India, Iraq, Pakistan. These 5 countries had a special arrangement. Iran gave them permission to pass through. Why? Because these are the countries that were not attacking Iran. These are the countries that either supported Iran diplomatically, bought Iranian oil, or stayed neutral. So for the past 6 weeks, while the Western world was locked out of Hormuz, China was sailing through quietly, consistently moving oil, moving cargo, building the relationship. And now America has declared a blockade, and America said something very specific. America said this blockade is against all ships entering or leaving Iranian ports, not just Western ships, all ships. Do you understand what that means? America is telling China, those ships you have been sending through Hormuz under our blockade, we are going to stop them. We are going to inspect them. We will seize them if they paid Iran's toll to get through. Think about what that means for a moment. America is not just blockading Iran. America is putting itself directly between China and China's oil supply. America is telling the second largest economy on earth and the largest manufacturer on earth and the country that produces more goods than any other country on earth that their ships, their cargo, their energy must now go through us first. That is not a blockade of Iran. That is a confrontation with China. Now, I want to use something I call the cascade problem to explain why this is so dangerous. And I want to be very clear that I am not predicting what will happen. I am explaining what the structural logic looks like. When you blockade a country's oil supply, that country faces a choice. Does it submit or does it find another way? But when you threaten a country's oil supply that is not even the country you are at war with, you create a completely different problem because that country has its own choices to make. And those choices were not part of your original calculation. China is not at war with America. China has been very careful not to get directly involved in this conflict. China sent weapons components to Iran quietly. China helped broker the ceasefire through Pakistan. China has been playing a very sophisticated game where it benefits from the war without being in the war. But a blockade that stops Chinese ships is different. That is direct. That is visible. That is the kind of thing that a government has to respond to publicly because its own population is watching. Think about this from China's perspective for a moment. You have ships in the water right now inside Hormuz carrying Chinese goods, and the United States Navy is floating out there saying, we are going to stop every ship that paid Iran's toll. And your ship did pay Iran's toll because that was the deal Iran offered, and you accepted because Iran was controlling the strait. What does China do? If China backs down, if China allows its ships to be stopped and inspected and potentially seized, China looks weak. China's credibility as a rising power takes a serious hit. Every country in Asia, every country in Africa, every country in Latin America that is watching the China. America competition asks the same question. Is China actually a match for America? If China cannot protect its own ships, maybe not. If China pushes back, if China tells its ships to keep moving, if China tells its navy to escort those vessels, you now have American warships and Chinese warships in the same 33-kilometer strait at the same time, both claiming the right to be there, both under orders from their governments, both with weapons loaded. That is the cascade problem. One decision in Washington this morning, issued on Truth Social just after midnight, creates a situation where two nuclear armed powers are now potentially in direct physical proximity in a corridor smaller than the English Channel. I'm going to be very careful here because I do not want to sensationalize this. I am not saying war between America and China is coming. I am saying the structure of what happened this morning creates a situation that has no clean exit. Let me go back to what actually happened over the past 48 hours. Because I think if you understand the sequence, you understand how we got here so fast. On Saturday, J.D. Vance flew to Islamabad. He sat for 21 hours with the Iranian delegation. They were negotiating, and by multiple accounts, including Iran's own foreign minister, they were close to an agreement. Abbas Araghchi, Iran's foreign minister, said on Sunday that they were inches away from what he called the Islamabad move, a memorandum of understanding, a formal document almost signed, and then something shifted. Araghchi said they encountered what he called maximalism and shifting goalposts. The American side kept moving the terms, and then Trump, while Vance was still in the air flying home, announced the blockade on Truth Social. So the sequence is we were almost at a deal, the deal fell apart. And within hours, America escalated to a blockade. Vance gave a press conference in Islamabad before he left, and he said something that I think reveals exactly what the American calculation is. He said, "I now want you to hear this carefully. The bad news is for Iran, much more than it is for us." Now, Vance is smart. He knows exactly what he is saying. What he is saying is, we think we have more leverage than they do. We think we can squeeze them harder than they can squeeze us. That is the logic of the blockade. It is a pressure move, apply more pressure, and maybe Iran comes back to the table with fewer demands. But here's the problem with that logic. And this is what I think Washington is missing. Iran is already under the maximum pressure it has ever faced in its history. America and Israel bombed it for 40 days. They killed the supreme leader, they destroyed factories, military bases, infrastructure, and Iran is still standing. Iran still has Hormuz. Iran still has its mines in the water. Iran still has its missiles. If 40 days of bombing did not make Iran submit, what makes anyone think a blockade will? And more importantly, who does the blockade actually hurt? Let me be very specific about this because this is the part of the story that I think gets buried in the news coverage. The blockade says no ships entering or leaving Iranian ports, but those ships are not just Iranian ships. There are 230 oil tankers sitting inside the Persian Gulf right now that have been waiting since the war started. Those tankers are from many different countries. There are Indian tankers, Chinese tankers, Iraqi tankers. These are ships that were already in the Gulf when the war began and have been stuck there ever since. On top of that, the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, the United Nations body that oversees global shipping, confirmed that there are 20,000 sailors aboard these vessels, 20,000 human beings sitting on ships in the Persian Gulf, unable to leave, waiting for someone to resolve this situation. The blockade does not rescue these sailors. The blockade makes their situation worse because now the strait is more contested, more dangerous, more uncertain than it was 24 hours ago. And then there is Iraq. This is the part that almost nobody is talking about. Iraq gets 90% of its food through the Strait of Hormuz, not 30%, not 50%, 90%. Iraq's grocery supply depends on ships being able to move through Hormuz. Iraq's economy is 90% oil revenue, and almost all of that oil goes out through Hormuz. Iraq is not a party to this war. Iraq did not bomb Iran. Iraq did not launch any missiles. Iraq is a country of 40 million people that is physically surrounded by the consequences of this conflict, and the blockade that America just announced makes the strait more dangerous for Iraqi ships as well. There is something else happening simultaneously that I think is very important to understand. While all of this is happening in the strait, Iran's foreign minister has already moved on to the next diplomatic front. Iraqi did not go home after Islamabad. He is going to Berlin, he is going to Paris, he is going to London. Iran is now bypassing Washington and going directly to Europe. Think about what that means strategically. Iran just told America, you are not the only game in town. We can talk to Germany, we can talk to France, we can talk to Britain. These are countries that need Iranian oil. These are countries that have their own economic problems because of the war. These are countries that have every reason to want a resolution that does not involve a naval blockade that could push oil to $150 a barrel. America wanted to isolate Iran, but the blockade may be pushing Iran into the arms of a diplomatic coalition that does not need American approval. Europe needs energy, China needs oil. Russia wants America stuck in the Middle East. These three forces all have reasons to find a way around the blockade rather than through it. And Britain, America's closest ally, the country that Trump said was sending minesweepers, has already said publicly it will not join the blockade. Britain said no. The UK, which has its own military bases in Bahrain and Qatar that were attacked by Iranian missiles, the country that should be most motivated to support America here, looked at the blockade and said, we are not doing this. Now, I want to bring this back to China because I think China is the key to understanding where this goes. Here is the position China is in right now. China has ships inside Hormuz. China has a 25-year strategic partnership with Iran worth $400 billion. China buys over 90% of Iran's oil. China just spent 6 weeks quietly helping Iran stay in the fight while publicly positioning itself as a peacemaker. China brokered the ceasefire through Pakistan. China was supposed to use that credit as leverage when Trump visits Beijing. And now America has announced a blockade that could stop Chinese ships. China cannot ignore this. Politically, China cannot be seen allowing its ships to be stopped and searched by the American Navy without any response. That would be domestically catastrophic for the Chinese leadership. But China also does not want a direct military confrontation with the United States in the Strait of Hormuz. That benefits nobody. That is the scenario everyone is trying to avoid. So what does China do? What China will do, and I think this is already in motion, is apply diplomatic pressure through every available channel simultaneously. China will call Iran. China will call Pakistan. China will call Russia. China will issue warnings through official statements. China will use every lever it has to make the situation as uncomfortable as possible for America without firing a single shot. And here is the most important thing. China's ships being in Hormuz right now are not an accident. China knew the blockade was coming. The announcement was made Sunday night. The ships were already in the strait. This is not a coincidence. China positioned those ships deliberately because a Chinese ship being stopped by an American Navy is a very different story than an Iranian ship being stopped. It is an incident that involves two major powers. It creates a completely different diplomatic crisis. China is not in the water by accident. China is in the water because being in the water creates leverage. Let me close with something I think about very often when I study these situations. Everyone is talking about the blockade as if it is a simple pressure move. America squeezes, Iran bends. That is the assumption behind the decision that was made last night. But history does not work that way. Blockades have a long history, and they almost never work the way the country imposing them thinks they will work. The British blockade of America in the War of 1812 did not break American resistance. It hardened it. The American blockade of Cuba has lasted 60 years, and the Cuban government is still there. The blockade of Gaza has been running for nearly 20 years. Blockades create hardship. They create suffering. They almost always hurt the people they are not aimed at more than the governments they are aimed at, because governments can absorb the pain. Ordinary people cannot. What this blockade will do is push oil higher. It is already above $100 a barrel. It will push markets lower. Dow futures are down 517 points this morning. It will put 20,000 sailors in more danger. It will create a food crisis in Iraq. It will push Iran closer to China, Russia, and Europe. And it will force China into a position where it must respond publicly in a way that it did not have to respond before. Was there another way? Yes, they were almost a deal. Iran's foreign minister said they were inches away. The Islamabad MO was nearly signed, but something in those final hours broke, and instead of more negotiation, America chose escalation. I am not saying Iran was negotiating in good faith. I am not saying America was wrong to be frustrated. I am saying that the decision to escalate from failed talks to a blockade in less than 24 hours in a body of water where Chinese ships are currently sitting is a decision with consequences that no one has fully mapped out yet. And those consequences are starting right now as we speak at 10 a.m. Eastern Time today. Think about this very carefully and push back on it, because the most important thing is not what I think. The most important thing is that you think it through yourself.